Hello and welcome to today's end of the week Fat Tail Daily. I'm joined by Nick Hubble, what time is it there, Nick? You are in Barcelona right now, I believe. I never know
Yeah,
what country you're in.
almost 9 a.m.
Right. So have the kids woken up yet?
Yeah, everyone's awake. So I've been allocated my father-in-law's bedroom as the recording studio for the next few weeks. Hence the change of background. No
Yep.
more banks outside the window getting knocked down. So a
Yeah,
bit of a
right.
change in scenery for everyone.
Well, cool. Let's get stuck into it then. Now, in today's issue, you're sort of focusing on the election that's happening in the US very imminently. Now, you draw an interesting parallel between Trump's NATO strategy and his current stance on tariffs. Can you elaborate why you believe his extreme tariff rhetoric, which has kind of been all over the news this week, might actually be aimed not at actually achieving a protectionist kind of strategy, but actually in achieving a freer trade environment?
Yeah, if you remember back to 2016, everyone was worried that Trump's policies would cause all sorts of chaos. He was threatening to do all sorts of foreign policy, crazy things. And everyone was worried this would start World War III and all the rest of it. And of course, the opposite happened. We had a period of unusual stability in geopolitics under Trump. And what I'm trying to say here is that the same, I don't know, negotiating tactic or political strategy is being followed by Trump, where he's threatening to something in order to try and achieve the opposite outcome. So with NATO, what he was threatening to do was withdraw American troops from Europe, and also to leave NATO. At one point, he threatened to do, and even to not defend Europe if they were invaded. And all these threats obviously caused all sorts of outrage. But what he was really trying to do was to get the Europeans to live up to their legal obligations under the NATO treaties, in terms of their spending on defense and also their manpower. And he wanted them to defend themselves rather than just relying on America. And he found it a bit dodgy that the Americans were defending Europe, while the Europeans were engaging in some dodgy trade practices for American goods, and not living up to their legal obligations. And so how would Kamala Harris go about trying to convince the Europeans to spend as much as they're supposed to? She probably asked them, whereas Trump would pursue like a counterintuitive reverse psychology type of negotiation, where he said, well, if you're not going to live up to your obligations, then we're not going to protect you. And it worked. European defense spending boomed. There was a lot of political stability under Trump, geopolitical stability, not political. And so my argument is it's the same story with tariffs. What Trump really wants is for Europeans and Chinese to stop their unfair trade practices, of which tariffs are just one. Currency manipulation would be another. And the way he's pursuing that goal is just like with NATO, reverse psychology. He's threatening to give the Europeans and the Chinese a dose of their own medicine. He's saying, well, if you don't get rid of your trade barriers, we're going to give you American trade barriers. He's pointing out that Europe's got this trade surplus with the US, as does China. Australia, by the way, has a trade deficit with the US, so oddly enough. But all these countries that are using trade practices to try and get their trade surplus with the US, he's saying, we'll give you a dose of your own medicine. We want to sell American cars in Europe rather than just allowing European cars to be sold in America, for example. The ridiculousness of his comments make this not obvious, but more plausible, right? Because obviously Americans are going to defend Europe if they're invaded by Russia or whoever it might be. That's never really under question. And tariffs of thousands of percent are also going to be a complete disaster for the US economy, as everyone knows. The point being that this is the typical bluster of a property tycoon, trying to force the issue by being ridiculous in his claims and trying to scare people into doing what he wants.
Must admit, it is quite amusing seeing it all unfold. You compare the current trade tensions with the Smoot-Hawley era of the 1920s. And just so people know, that was an act in the 1920s. I think it was like which put 20% tariffs on goods imported into the US from abroad. Trump, obviously, I think he said one of them for Mexican cars, for example, was 100% tariff or something like that. But what key differences do you see between then and now that might lead to a different outcome this time?
Well, it's the similarities that are the key, right? Because what happened back then, it's debated by economists, but a lot of them claim that it was the Smoot-Hawley tariffs which elevated existing tariffs radically. which triggered the Great Depression. What was really going on was more of a trade war, back and forth between different countries with their different trade policies. But it was the stock market which melted down once the Smoot-Hawley passage became extremely likely, because it had gotten bogged down in the Senate. But once the Senate was likely to approve it and the president said he would sign off on it, that's when the stock market melted down in 1929. So for investors, this is the key, right? Because if you're thinking, well, are Trump's tariffs going to impact the stock market? That's exactly what happened in 1929 and triggered that Great Depression. So that's the key implication here, or inference. And I'm arguing that this claim that we're going to experience that again is false. I'm arguing the opposite's going to happen. We're going to have trade barriers fall in places like Europe and China instead. Eventually, at least, possibly the Americans will actually have to play hardball for a while. But I think that Trump's intention is actually more free trade. So
Yeah, right.
we shouldn't be panicking about a replay of the Smoot-Hawley story. That's just, I mean, I'm making the argument. I'm obviously not completely sure. You know, there's no risk-free investment play or anything like that. But based on Trump's historical behavior, I think that's what investors should be concluding here. And if he can crack China and European trade barriers to some extent, that would be really good news for a lot of the companies in the US, specific companies that would benefit from freer trade with Europe and China. It's also completely opposite to what everyone is hearing about in the mainstream media, that these tariffs will be disastrous and terrible. And of course, ironically enough, when the media talks about European tariffs on America or on Chinese renewable energy goods, then tariffs are good. But as soon as Trump says tariffs are the most beautiful word in the dictionary or something like that, he said, then suddenly tariffs are bad.
Yeah. You suggest that the Trump presidency might actually ease global economic tensions rather than increase them. What specific sectors or markets do you think could benefit most from a Trump win?
From the trade side of things, or from a Trump win more generally?
Maybe both.
Yeah, so from trade, it'd be the US industry, anything that can export to new markets, so being perhaps American car manufacturers, that sort of thing. Obviously, Trump would be good for energy stocks, given he's a lot less likely to be pro-green and he's a lot more likely to be pro-fossil fuels. So there could be a whole new wave of that under Trump. What else would there be? I think people should be concerned about Europe and the fate of Europe without the trade protections that a lot of European firms rely on. So that could escalate what's already been a pretty bad period for Europe's industry, what's left of it, I guess we should say. The most interesting one is China, especially for Australia. If Trump can crack Chinese unfair trade practices, that completely rearranges a lot of things for Australia, because obviously we have that key trading partner in China, commodity demand, so on and so forth. Perhaps the story of the last 23 years is this boom in China, this industrial boom in China, making things and Americans buying them, and Australia was selling the commodities. So if all of that gets rejigged somehow, especially given that America does have plenty of its own resources, and it's obviously cheaper to produce them in America and provide them to American industry, that could completely shift things for Australia's resources industry. So perhaps that's the most close to home for Australian investors.
Cool. All right, Nick. Well, I think we'll leave it there. Nice and short and sharp this time. I know that your kids are just waking up, so I'll leave you get back to those. Yeah, take a read of Nick's original article. I provided the link below, and please sign up to Fat Tail Daily. And remember, I guess, I think the mainstream narrative is that they don't really like what Trump says, but look what he does instead. I think that's the main message, right?
Yeah. It doesn't matter what he says; they won't like it. The question is,
that's true.
On his track record, I think you should be a bit more optimistic than the media, which is not saying much, but a lot more optimistic then.
Yeah. There we go. Thank you, Nick. Take care, and we'll see you next time.